The dust on the mahogany box was the only thing undisturbed in my wife's office, a silent witness to 3 decades of shared secrets that I was finally forced to confront. I held the small brass key, my hands shaking not from the weight of my 68 years, but from the way my son, Julian, was staring at me from the doorway with a predatory intensity. His face wasn't pale from the natural, heavy grief of a grieving son who had just lost his mother. It was the translucent, sickly white of a condemned man watching his executioner prepare the final knot. "Don't open it, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice under extreme pressure. His eyes locked onto the metal in my hand with a look of pure, unadulterated desperation. I could feel the coldness radiating from him, a sharp contrast to the warmth I had spent 31 years believing we shared in this very house in Columbus. Something was buried in that box that had the power to rewrite our entire family history, and I knew in my gut that the truth was about to be unleashed. The heavy silence of our home was broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing as I processed his physical resistance and the sudden, sharp shift in the room's atmosphere. Julian took a predatory step forward, closing the angle of the doorway as if his body could physically block the truth from escaping that wooden vessel and reaching my ears. The glint of the brass key felt like a brand against my palm, a physical manifestation of a secret that had been dormant for more than 3 long decades of marriage. I knew, with an instinct honed over decades of professional skepticism and investigation, that this small chest held something far more volatile than old love letters or simple trinkets. This was the moment of no return, the peak of a domestic tension that had been brewing in the shadows while I chose to look the other way. If I turned that key, the world I knew would cease to exist, yet I couldn't stop my fingers from tightening around the cold metal of the lock. If you believe that family secrets are often the heaviest burdens any human being has to carry through life, then please subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could comment below with the current time in your city right now, as I am truly curious to know who across the world is awake to hear this. It helps me connect with all of you who are watching these deep accounts of justice and betrayal from different corners of the globe. Your engagement means a lot to the storytelling process, as we dive deep into the complexities of human nature and the hidden lives that people lead behind closed doors. This story is just beginning, and your presence here as we peel back the layers of this mystery is what makes this community so special to me. Let us continue into the heart of the matter, where the shadows of the past finally begin to meet the cold, hard light of the present-day reality. My name is Arthur Vance, and at 68 years old, I find myself looking back at a life defined by the pursuit of hidden truths and the exposure of lies. For 34 years, I served as a lead insurance fraud investigator in Columbus, Ohio, a career that required me to be part detective, part accountant, and part psychological profiler. My daily routine involved dissecting the wreckage of human greed, finding the intentional spark in the accidental fire, or spotting the rehearsed tremor in a claimant's voice. I was the man who looked past the polished presentations and the expensive legal filings to find the one inconsistency that brought the entire house of cards crashing down. Over 3 decades in the field taught me that people are capable of incredible feats of deception when money and reputation are at stake. I took immense pride in my ability to remain objective, never letting emotion cloud my judgment when the facts were laid out before me in black and white. The core belief that governed every single day of my professional life was simple and unyielding. The evidence never lies, but the people involved in the evidence always do. I lived by this mantra, trusting the paper trail, the digital footprint, and the physical forensics over the most heartfelt testimonials or the most convincing displays of innocence. However, I committed the ultimate professional sin by turning off my instincts at my own front door every single night, when I returned home to my family. I desperately wanted to believe that my house was the one place on earth where I didn't need to be an investigator, a sanctuary where love replaced scrutiny. I let my deep affection for my wife, Martha, and my misplaced pride in our son, Julian, blind me to the very warning signs I was trained to detect. I wasn't just a victim of a clever stranger's elaborate scheme. I was a victim of my own human need to believe that my life was the exception. This failure of mine wasn't due to a lack of skill, but rather a profound vulnerability that I am now forced to acknowledge with a painful sense of genuine self-criticism. I had spent so much of my life surrounded by the worst aspects of human nature that I developed a psychological blind spot for the people I loved. I was so exhausted by the constant vigilance required at work that I chose to be willfully ignorant of the inconsistencies appearing within my own domestic walls. I told myself that suspicious behavior in my wife was just the result of aging, and that my son's shifting personality was simply the evolution of a modern businessman. I traded my professional integrity for a false sense of domestic peace, a bargain that I would eventually pay for with nearly everything I had worked for. This vulnerability was my undoing, a soft spot in my armor that allowed the betrayal to fester in the dark for years without me ever raising a hand to stop it. Martha and I were often held up as the gold standard for couples in our quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a testament to what I believed was 31 years of transparency. We had built a life on a foundation of comforting rituals that seemed to shield us from the chaos of the outside world and the stresses of my job. Every single morning at exactly 6 a.m., we shared a pot of black coffee in our sunroom, discussing the weather or the small happenings in the community. At 7 p.m., we would transition to a glass of vintage red wine on the back porch, watching the sunset and reflecting on the decades we had spent together. I remember the day of Julian's graduation from business school with a clarity that still hurts. The sun was bright and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass. Martha leaned her head on my shoulder, her signature jasmine perfume mixing with the scent of the old book she loved, and whispered that we had finally raised a protector. I can still see the soft, tired smile on her face that afternoon as she watched Julian move through the crowd of graduates with such effortless confidence and grace. "We did it, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and a strange, lingering sadness that I didn't have the wisdom to question then. "He is going to take care of us now that we are getting older, and we can finally rest from the constant weight of all our hard work." At the time, her words felt like a benediction, a promise that the next chapter of our lives would be one of ease and shared security. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, believing that my career as a fraud investigator had provided the stability our son needed to become a leader. I didn't realize that the rest she was talking about was actually a surrender, or that the protector we had raised was already sharpening his knives for us. We were standing at the peak of our happiness, completely unaware of the steep and jagged cliff that lay just ahead of us. But things began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways about 5 years ago, shifting the atmosphere of our home from total warmth to a strange, guarded caution. Martha started closing her laptop with a startled, guilty snap whenever I entered the room, and she became increasingly frantic about organizing the files in her desk. I dismissed these odd behaviors as the simple anxiety of aging, or perhaps an early shadow of the long, debilitating illness that would eventually steal her away. I never once questioned why Julian suddenly started showing up every single weekend with thick legal pads and financial updates, exclusively for his mother's private eyes. They would spend hours huddled together in the study, whispering behind closed doors while I was left alone in the garden to prune roses I didn't know were dying. I was content in my ignorance, happy to see my son taking an interest in our family's future while I enjoyed the quiet, simple peace of my retirement. The first real moment of change happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I found a stack of bank statements in the trash that I didn't recognize at all. When I asked Martha about them, she became uncharacteristically defensive, her voice rising in a way that signaled a hidden, internal panic I couldn't yet identify. "It's just some old accounts I'm closing out, Arthur. You don't need to worry about every single piece of paper in this house," she said sharply. I backed down immediately, not wanting to cause her any unnecessary stress during what I thought was a difficult transition into her senior years. I convinced myself that I was being overbearing, applying my work habits to my marriage, and I vowed to be more trusting of her private affairs. Looking back, that was the exact moment the crack in our foundation appeared, a small opening that Julian would soon exploit with a cold and calculated efficiency. I had ignored my primary instinct for the sake of a quiet dinner, a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Julian is now 34 years old, a man who consistently wears $3,000 bespoke suits, even to a casual Sunday brunch at our local neighborhood bistro. He is a striking figure, looking exactly like a younger, more polished version of myself, but he carries a predatory, hungry edge in his eyes at all times. He worked as an independent wealth manager, or so he claimed to everyone, though his extravagant lifestyle always seemed a bit disconnected from his modest client list. He drove limited edition German cars and wore gold watches that cost more than my first 3 years of salary combined, yet he never seemed to be working. He moved through the world with the immense confidence of someone who had never known a day of true financial struggle or the fear of failure. There was a certain coldness in the way he calculated the value of every person he met, a trait I initially admired as a sign of ambition. I wanted to believe he was the pinnacle of the Vance legacy, a man who had finally achieved the status I had worked for. In those early years of his career, Julian was the picture of success and filial devotion, often taking us out to expensive dinners and talking about our future. He spoke with a polished Ivy League cadence that made his every word sound like a researched fact, and he always seemed to have an answer for everything. I watched him command rooms at the golf club, his charm acting as a veil for the calculating mind that lay beneath the expensive Linho shirts. He was the son every father in Columbus wanted, a high achiever who still made time to check on his parents and discuss their retirement plans. I felt a swell of pride every time I saw his name on a local business journal list or heard a neighbor praise his sharp financial mind. He was my greatest achievement, or so I thought, a reflection of the hard work and discipline that Martha and I had instilled in him. I didn't see the hollow space where his empathy should have been, masked by his tailored clothes and expensive habits. When Martha first fell ill, Julian stepped into our daily lives with a terrifyingly efficient level of control that I, in my immense grief, found incredibly comforting. "Dad, let me handle the medical bills, the insurance claims, and the family truster," he said, while gently patting my hand with a look of deep, rehearsed concern. "You just focus on being there for Mom. You don't need the added stress of these numbers and legal jargon during such a difficult and emotional period." I thanked God every night for a son who was so capable and willing to shoulder the heavy administrative burdens that come with a terminal diagnosis. I didn't see the way his eyes would glaze over with a cold, fiscal hunger whenever he looked at the deed to our family home on the desk. To me, it was the place where we raised our family. To him, it was nothing more than a liquidity event, waiting to be triggered. He was already moving pieces on a chessboard I didn't even know we were playing on, all while I sat by Martha's bedside. The way Julian handled the initial stages of Martha's treatment was almost heroic. As he coordinated with the best doctors and managed all the complex paperwork for us, he became the primary point of contact for the hospital, ensuring that I was shielded from the cold, technical realities of her declining health and rising costs. I felt a profound sense of relief, believing that my son was finally fulfilling the role of the protector that Martha had envisioned for him years ago. He was always there, with a supportive word or a new folder of documents for me to sign for the sake of administrative ease. I was so consumed by the sight of my wife fading away that I signed whatever he put in front of me, trusting him implicitly. I saw his actions as a selfless sacrifice of his own professional time, never imagining that he was actually billing our estate for every hour he spent. He had become the gatekeeper of our lives, and I had handed him the keys with a grateful, tearful smile. During this period, Julian's public image remained flawless, as he frequently shared updates about his mother's brave fight with our social circle and the members of the club. He was the devoted son, the pillar of strength for his aging father, and the brilliant manager who was keeping the family finances stable. People would stop me in the grocery store to tell me how lucky I was to have a son like Julian during such a tragic time. I would nod in agreement, feeling a sense of communal validation that reinforced my own internal narrative of our family's unbreakable bond. He was cultivating a perfect reputation that would later serve as his primary shield against any potential accusations of misconduct or financial elder abuse. He was a master of optics, knowing exactly how to perform the role of the grieving son while simultaneously hollowing out the very foundation of my life. The stage was set for a betrayal of monumental proportions, and I was the one who had helped him build the scenery. I remember one specific evening when we were sitting in the study and Julian was organizing a new set of folders he had brought from his downtown office. He looked up at me with a smile that reached his eyes. Yet the warmth didn't seem to stay there for more than a fleeting second. "We're going to make sure Mom has the best care possible, no matter what the cost is, Dad," he said with a definitive, professional nod. I felt a lump in my throat, touched by what I thought was his absolute commitment to his mother's comfort in her final months. He spoke about the importance of asset protection and long-term planning, as if they were acts of love rather than cold, calculated financial maneuvers. I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder, telling him how proud I was of the man he had become and the responsibilities he took. He didn't flinch, but he didn't lean into the touch either. A small physical detail that I would only understand much later. At the time, I attributed his slight physical distance to the professional stoicism he had developed in the high-stakes world of wealth management and corporate finance. I thought he was simply trying to stay strong for me, maintaining a professional demeanor so that I wouldn't see the depth of his own personal pain. I admired his strength, thinking it was a trait he had inherited from my years in the field, where showing emotion was often seen as a weakness. We sat there in the quiet room, the only sound being the rustle of papers and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I felt a sense of profound security, believing that even if the worst happened to Martha, Julian and I would stand together against the world. It was a beautiful, convincing lie that he had crafted with the skill of a master artisan, and I was his most willing and devoted audience. I was living in a carefully constructed theater of filial love, unaware that the play was nearing its most tragic and violent act. As Martha's condition worsened, Julian's presence in our home became almost constant, as he took over more and more of the daily operations and decision-making processes. He began to handle all the incoming mail, claiming that he didn't want me to be burdened by the sight of medical bills or insurance denials. This seemed like a natural extension of his role as the family's financial manager, and I was more than happy to let him take the lead. I stopped checking the mailbox, and I stopped looking at our joint bank accounts, trusting that Julian was keeping everything in perfect professional order. I was retreating into a world of pure emotion, focusing entirely on the precious time I had left with my wife, while Julian was quietly rewriting our reality. He was systematically cutting off my access to the information I would have needed to see the fraud that was beginning to blossom under my own roof. I was being isolated with my own consent, A perfect victim for the man who knew my every weakness and my every fear. The transition from a supportive son to a controlling manager happened so gradually that I never felt the moment the balance of power shifted entirely in his favor. He began to speak to me with a subtle, condescending tone, as if my questions about our finances were a sign of my own growing confusion or mental decline. "You're tired, Dad. Let me handle this. You're not thinking clearly with everything going on with Mom," he would say with a sigh of feigned patience. I began to doubt my own perceptions, wondering if the stress of Martha's illness was truly taking a toll on my cognitive abilities and my legendary investigator's instincts. I started to rely even more on Julian's version of events, seeing him as the only stable anchor in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic and painful. He was gaslighting me in the most gentle, loving way possible, ensuring that I would never question his authority until it was far too late to do anything. By the time the first real signs of the betrayal began to surface, I was already so deeply entrenched in Julian's narrative that I was willing to defend him against my own eyes. I had become an accomplice in my own destruction, a man who had traded his lifelong pursuit of truth for a few more months of a comfortable family-focused lie. I was standing in the middle of a crime scene that I was refusing to recognize, even as the evidence began to pile up around my feet like fallen leaves. The man I had raised to be a protector was now the greatest threat I had ever faced, and I was the one who had given him the map to my heart. This was the world as it existed before the box was opened, a world built on the fragile glass of a father's hope and a son's cold-blooded ambition. The countdown to the moment of truth had already begun, and the final phrase of this act would be the last breath of my peaceful, ignorant existence. Exactly 6 months before Martha passed away, Julian approached me with what he described as a sophisticated tax strategy designed to preserve our family's wealth for the coming decades. He explained with great urgency that he needed me to sign a formal document moving $150,000 from our joint savings into a specialized private management account under his firm's direct supervision. "It'll shield the money from the long and expensive probate process, Dad. It is strictly for your future security," he said with a convincing level of professional authority. I signed the paperwork without ever reading the fine print, my mind being far too occupied with holding Martha's trembling hand in the cold oncology ward. Julian's gratitude felt so incredibly real in that moment. He hugged me tightly and actually cried, thanking me for finally trusting his professional judgment with our family legacy. Looking back, I realized that my emotional exhaustion was his greatest asset, a tool he used to bypass the very skepticism that had defined my entire career. The requests did not stop there, but instead escalated in frequency and scale as Martha's condition grew more dire and my own focus became increasingly blurred by grief. Julian would often corner me in the kitchen, claiming that certain market fluctuations required immediate liquidations of our smaller assets to maintain the overall health of our portfolio. "We need to stay ahead of the curve, Dad, or we risk losing the cushion Mom worked so hard to build over 30 years, he would say during those hurried meetings. On one occasion, I asked him for a simple breakdown of the accounts, and his face instantly transformed into a mask of wounded, deep-seated professional pride. "Are you really questioning my expertise now, after everything I've done to keep this family afloat?" he asked, his voice dripping with a calculated, manipulative sense of hurt. I apologized immediately, feeling like a burden to the son who was seemingly sacrificing his own time to manage my messy, complicated affairs. "Dad, I need you to understand that moving the titles of the Florida property now is the only way to avoid a massive capital gains hit next year," Julian said. He was standing in my study, the sunlight catching the gold of his watch, looking every bit the successful manager I wanted him to be for us. I looked at the deed on the desk, feeling a strange hesitation, but his gaze was steady and filled with what looked like genuine concern for my welfare. "I've run the numbers 3 times, and this is the only logical path forward for the Vance estate," he continued, his tone clinical and completely devoid of any doubt. I picked up the pen, the weight of it feeling heavier than usual, and added my signature to the bottom of the legal document he had prepared. He didn't smile, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief, sharp flash of satisfaction that I chose to interpret as professional relief. I was handing over pieces of my life, one signature at a time, convinced that I was building a fortress of security. "Is the money safe, Julian? I just need to know we can cover the new experimental treatments the hospital suggested for your mother's comfort," I asked him one evening. He barely looked up from his tablet, his thumb scrolling through a series of complex charts that meant nothing to a man who just wanted his wife to breathe. "Don't worry about the costs, Arthur. That's exactly why we moved the funds into the high-yield trust last month," he replied without a single second of hesitation. His voice was a calm, steady anchor in the storm of my anxiety, a sound that I relied on to keep my own sanity from slipping away completely. He made me feel like the financial world was a machine he controlled with a single touch, a master of the invisible forces that governed our future. I sat back in my chair, exhaling a breath I didn't know I was holding, and thanked him for being the man I couldn't be right then. I was a fraud investigator who had forgotten that the most dangerous lies are the ones told with a steady hand. By the 3rd year of this arrangement, Julian began a systematic campaign to isolate me from the friends and colleagues who might have questioned his sudden, unchecked authority. He started suggesting that my old work friends from the insurance firm were too cynical and were only calling me to gossip about the tragedy of Martha's decline. Whenever my brother or our cousins would call the house, Julian was usually the one to answer, telling them that I was resting or too overwhelmed for visitors. He even convinced me to stop attending our weekly neighborhood poker game, claiming that the late nights were making me irritable and were negatively affecting my health. I began to feel like the world outside our front door was becoming increasingly hostile and confusing, leaving Julian as my only reliable source of truth and guidance. He would bring me the newspaper and carefully selected updates about the world, effectively creating a controlled environment where his narrative was the only one. This isolation was not a sudden event, but a slow erosion of my social connections, performed under the guise of protecting my fragile emotional state from the outside world. Julian would often mention how certain neighbors had made insensitive comments about my age or my ability to handle the house alone once Martha was gone. "They're just looking for gossip. Dad, they don't really care about you the way I do," he would say with a sympathetic, knowing shake of his head. I began to withdraw into the safety of the house, feeling a growing sense of gratitude for the son who was standing as a shield between me and the world. I didn't realize that by cutting off my friends, he was removing the only people who would have noticed the inconsistencies in my life and his spending. He was pruning my social circle like a gardener prunes a hedge, shaping my reality to fit a design that only he could see. I was becoming a ghost in my own community, a man whose presence was being replaced by his son's carefully managed representation. As the months dragged on, the pace of his manipulations quickened, and the phrases he used became progressively shorter and more definitive, leaving no room for my own input. "Child to the house is a liability," he would state during breakfast, his eyes never leaving his phone, as he scrolled through real estate listings I hadn't asked to see. "The taxes are soaring, and your pension fund is underperforming. We need to think about a smaller, more manageable living situation for you very soon." I could feel the walls of my own life closing in, but every time I tried to voice a concern, he would shut me down with a cold, professional sigh. I started to notice small things. Missing silver from the dining room, a drawer in Martha's jewelry box that was suspiciously empty, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was a fraud investigator who was willfully ignoring the biggest fraud of his life because the perpetrator was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. I remember a specific night when I found Julian in the study at 2 a.m. The blue light of his laptop illuminating a face that looked entirely foreign to me. He was staring at a spreadsheet with an expression of such cold, calculated intensity that I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down my spine in the hallway. When he realized I was there, he didn't jump or act guilty. He simply closed the screen and asked me if I was having trouble sleeping again. Just checking the market. "Dad, someone has to stay awake to make sure our interests are protected while you rest," he said with a thin, sharp smile. I nodded and went back to bed, but the image of his face in that cold light stayed with me, a seed of doubt that I refused to water. I told myself it was just the stress of the job, the heavy burden of managing a family estate in a volatile and unforgiving economic climate. I was a master of self-deception, using my own professional vocabulary to justify the very red flags that should have alerted me to the danger. The final phase of this act was marked by a series of mandatory document signings that Julian insisted were required by new federal banking regulations for senior citizens. He would bring these papers to me late at night when my eyes were tired from reading to Martha and my mind was heavy with the weight of her suffering. "Just sign here, and one more on the back, Dad. It's all part of the new compliance protocols for the Vance Trust," he would say. I didn't even look at the titles of the pages anymore, my trust in him having become a reflexive action, a way to simplify a life that had become too complex. He was moving with a frantic, silent speed now, as if he knew that the clock was ticking and the window of my blind faith was eventually going to close. Every signature was another brick in the wall he was building around me, a wall designed to keep me in and the truth out for as long as possible. I was signing my own death warrant as a free man, and I was doing it with a smile for my son. As we reached the end of that final year of Martha's life, the atmosphere in our home had become brittle, like a piece of ancient parchment ready to crumble at the touch. Julian rarely spoke about anything other than logistics and administration, his vocabulary having become entirely corporate, stripped of any lingering traces of filial affection or human warmth. I felt more like a client than a father, a data point in a larger financial strategy that I was no longer permitted to see or understand in its entirety. I started to feel a sense of impending doom, a feeling I had experienced many times before a major fraud bust at work, but I couldn't place the source. The signs were all there, the changed passwords, the missing mail, the way he would suddenly stop talking when I entered a room, but I kept my eyes tightly shut. I was a man waiting for a storm that I was pretending didn't exist, standing on a beach as the tide pulled back for the coming tsunami. The final phrase of this act was the quiet before the roar, the moment everything was about to change. The social isolation Julian imposed on me reached its peak during the final months of Martha's battle, a time when I needed human connection the most. He had effectively become my sole window to the outside world, filtering every phone call and every visitor through his own distorted lens of protection. I remember my old partner from the department, Detective Mike Sullivan, trying to stop by with a casserole and a bottle of scotch for our usual Friday talk. Julian met him at the gate and told him that I was in the middle of a private medical consultation and couldn't be disturbed under any circumstances. Mike left a message that I never received, a heartfelt note of support that Julian later threw in the trash, along with my other distractions. I felt a growing sense of loneliness that I couldn't explain, not realizing that my son was systematically dismantling my support network to ensure no one could interfere with his plans. I was becoming a ghost in my own neighborhood, a man whose life was being managed by a shadow. Every conversation we had during that period felt like a transaction, a cold exchange of data points that left me feeling increasingly diminished and irrelevant in my own home. Julian would sit at the breakfast table, his eyes fixed on a glowing screen, delivering financial reports that sounded like a foreign language to my tired ears. He used technical terms like tax loss harvesting and probate avoidance to justify moving large sums of money that I had spent decades saving for our retirement. When I asked why our primary savings account was suddenly showing a balance that seemed much lower than I remembered, he sighed with a practiced, weary patience. "You're confusing the gross assets with the net liquidity. Dad, it's a common mistake for someone who isn't tracking the daily market volatility like I am." He made me feel like my questions were a burden, a sign of my own cognitive decline rather than a legitimate concern about our future security. I retreated into a quiet, obedient silence. I've already spoken to the estate planners, and they agree that the house should be placed in a separate LLC for your own protection, Julian stated one evening. He was pacing the living room, a glass of water in his hand, looking like a man who was carrying the entire weight of our family's survival on his back. I looked around the room, at the photos of our wedding and Julian's first birthday, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss for a world that was being liquidated. Is that really necessary, son? Your mother and I always wanted this house to stay exactly as it is, a memory of everything we built together, I asked softly. He stopped pacing and looked at me with a cold, clinical gaze that made me feel like I was a difficult client he was trying to manage. Memories don't pay the property taxes, Arthur. We need to be realistic if you want to maintain this lifestyle after Mum is gone. I felt small and foolish, a man of the past trying to argue with a man of the future. The pressure to sell our vacation cottage in Michigan became a constant theme in our weekly financial briefings, a topic Julian pursued with a relentless and focused determination. That cottage was where Julian learned to swim, and where Martha spent her happiest summers reading on the screened-in porch, far away from the city. It's a depreciating asset with high maintenance costs, and frankly, you're never going to use it again without Mom there to enjoy it, he argued. His words were like a physical blow to my chest, a cruel reminder of the reality I was trying so hard to ignore every single day. He presented me with a pre-signed sales agreement and a pen, his expression expectant and entirely devoid of any sentimental attachment to our shared family history. I looked at the document, the address of our little piece of heaven typed in cold, black ink, and felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I signed it anyway, wanting to end the argument and return to the quiet of Martha's room where the world still made sense. I started to notice that Julian's wardrobe was becoming even more extravagant, his collection of luxury watches expanding while he claimed our medical expenses were draining our reserves. He would show up at the hospital wearing a new Patek Philippe that I knew cost more than a year of Martha's specialized treatment, yet he never mentioned where the money came from. When I pointed it out, he claimed it was a gift from a high-profile client he had helped through a difficult merger earlier that spring. Success attracts success, Dad. I have to maintain an image if I want to keep attracting the kind of capital that keeps this family secure, he explained. I wanted to believe him, I truly did, but the investigator in me was finally starting to wake up from its long, grief-induced slumber in the corner. I noticed the way he checked his reflection in every glass surface, a man obsessed with the surface of things while the core of our family was rotting away. The signs were everywhere now. The bank called about a missed payment on the secondary mortgage. Julian, I thought you said everything was on automatic withdrawal, I mentioned one morning, my heart racing with a sudden, sharp anxiety. He didn't even blink, his hand reaching for the coffee pot with a steady, practiced grace that I had always admired in him as a businessman. Just a technical glitch at the branch. Dad, I've already contacted the regional manager to have it corrected, and the late fees waived immediately. He spoke with such absolute conviction that I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a feeling of safety that I was becoming increasingly desperate to maintain. I didn't ask for a confirmation number or a copy of the correspondence. choosing instead to believe the lie that was so much more comfortable than the truth. I was a man who had made a career out of verifying every detail, yet I was now accepting the most transparent excuses without a single follow-up question. I was hiding from my own instincts, a prisoner of my own desperate need for a son. The isolation from my brother, David, was particularly painful. As we had always been close and shared a love for fishing and old cars that Julian never understood. Every time David tried to call, Julian would tell me he was busy with his own life, or that he had made a dismissive comment about my stubbornness regarding the estate. David doesn't understand the complexities of modern finance. Dad, he's still living in the 80s, and his advice is only going to confuse you more. I stopped reaching out to the only person who could have given me an objective perspective on the situation, fearing that David would judge my perceived weakness. Julian was creating a world where he was the only source of validation, the only person who truly understood the burdens I was carrying as a husband and father. I was being conditioned to see my own family as a threat to my stability, while the real threat was sitting right across the table from me. I was a professional investigator who had been completely compromised by his own emotions and his son's cold-blooded tactical manipulation. As the final weeks of Martha's life approached, the house felt less like a home and more like a corporate headquarters for a failing enterprise I didn't own. Julian was always on the phone in the hallway, his voice low and urgent, discussing margin calls and emergency liquidations that he never explained to me in detail. I would catch him looking at me with a strange, calculating expression, as if he were trying to determine exactly how much longer I would remain a viable asset. He began to talk about my memory issues in front of the hospice nurses, creating a medical narrative that would later support his claims of my incapacity. He's been very confused lately, especially about the bank accounts. I'm just trying to keep him from making a mistake he can't undo later. I felt a flash of anger, but I was too tired to fight back, too consumed by the sight of my wife's slow and agonizing departure from this world. I was being prepared for my own institutionalization while I was still mourning the woman I had loved for 31 years. The pace of the documents I was required to sign increased to a daily occurrence, each one described as an urgent administrative correction to the Vance Family Trust. Julian would bring these papers to me at Martha's bedside, using the emotional weight of the setting to ensure my compliance without any unnecessary delays or questions. Mum would want us to have this settled before anything happens, Dad. It's the final piece of the plan she and I discussed for your retirement. I would sign my name on the lines he indicated, my hand shaking with the effort of staying upright while my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. He was using my wife's dying wishes as a lever to pry away the last remnants of my financial independence and my personal dignity as a man. I was a man who had spent his life protecting others from fraud, yet I was now the primary victim of the most intimate betrayal imaginable. I was a ghost in my own life, signing away my future to a man I no longer recognized. Every time I looked at Julian during those final days, I saw a stranger wearing the face of the son I had raised with such pride and care. The warmth that used to be in his eyes had been replaced by a flat, metallic sheen that reflected nothing but his own ambitious and hollow internal world. I realized that he didn't see Martha as a mother or me as a father. He saw us as obstacles to be managed and assets to be harvested. The realization was so horrific that I pushed it deep into the back of my mind, refusing to acknowledge the monster I had helped create. I told myself that the stress of the situation was changing him, that once the funeral was over, he would return to being the boy I knew. I was a man of evidence who was willfully ignoring the most damning proof of a crime ever presented to me in my long career. I was choosing to live in a lie because the truth was too heavy to carry while I was still saying goodbye. The neighbors stopped coming by altogether, having been told by Julian that I was in a delicate state and that visitors were only causing me increased agitation and confusion. I would see them through the window, walking their dogs or mowing their lawns, and I felt like I was watching a world that I no longer belonged to. I was being erased from my own community, one polite lie at a time, until the only person left in my orbit was the man who was stealing my life. Julian would tell me how difficult it was for him to manage my social obligations while also running his firm, making me feel like a burden. "I'm doing all of this for you, Dad. I just want you to be able to focus on what matters during these final, precious days." I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, thanking him for his sacrifice, while he was actually building a wall of silence around my existence. I was a master of investigation who had been outmaneuvered by a man who had learned everything he knew from me. I remember finding a legal folder in the back of Julian's car one day when I was looking for my sunglasses. A folder labeled Vance Estate, Liquidation Strategy. I opened it and saw a list of my own possessions. Each one assigned a market value and a projected date for sale or disposal after Martha's passing. My vintage car, my collection of rare coins, and even Martha's grandmother's silver were all listed as non-essential assets to be converted into cash for the trust. I felt a cold, sharp blade of fear pierce through my heart. But when Julian caught me with the folder, he was ready with a perfect explanation. "It's just a standard contingency plan. And Dad, the bank requires a full asset inventory to maintain the credit line for Mom's specialized nursing care." He took the folder from my hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I, once again, chose to believe the lie over the evidence. I was an investigator who was failing his most important case, blinded by the very love that was supposed to be my strength. "You need to trust me, Arthur. I'm the only one who can navigate this mess and keep you in this house for as long as possible," he said. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, the light behind him making him look like a dark, imposing silhouette that I could no longer see through. I nodded slowly, my voice trapped in my throat, a prisoner of the fear that I was losing my mind just as he had suggested. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of paperwork and legal jargon, and Julian was the only one offering me a hand to pull me out. I didn't realize that the hand he was offering was the same one that was holding my head under the water every time I tried to breathe. I was a man who had spent 34 years catching people like him. Yet I was now his most compliant and grateful victim in my own house. I was waiting for the end of the story, not knowing that the climax had already passed and I was just living in the aftermath. The final signature I gave before Martha died was on a document that I later realized was a waiver of my right to an independent audit of the Vance Trust. Julian told me it was a privacy shield to keep the bank from prying into our family's private financial affairs during a time of such deep personal grief. "We don't need strangers looking through Mom's medical bills and our private accounts. Dad, it's better if we keep everything in-house and managed by people who care." I was so tired, so utterly broken by the sight of my wife's struggle, that I would have signed anything just to be left alone in the quiet room. I gave him the power to hide his crimes behind a wall of legal immunity, a wall that I helped him build with my own steady, trusting hand. I was a fraud investigator who had just authorized the greatest fraud of my life, a man who had been defeated by his own son's cold-blooded tactical brilliance. The act was nearly over, and the stage was set for the final, tragic revelation that would destroy what was left. As I sat by Martha's bed on her final night, I felt a sense of profound failure that I couldn't quite put into words, a feeling that I had missed something vital. I looked at her pale, beautiful face, and I felt like I had failed to protect the world she had built for us with such care and love. Julian was in the hallway, his voice a low and steady murmur as he discussed transfer protocols and settlement dates with an unknown person on the phone. I realized then that the silence in our home was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a house that had been hollowed out from the inside. The woman I loved was leaving me, And the son I had raised was already counting the coins from her eyes before she had even closed them. I was a man who had lost his instincts, his assets, and his family, all while believing I was being taken care of by the best. The final phrase of this act was a silent prayer for a truth I was still too afraid to actually see with my own eyes. The funeral was a blur of expensive flowers and rehearsed condolences, a spectacle of grief that Julian managed with the same cold-blooded efficiency he had used on our accounts. He stood at the front of the chapel, the perfect image of a grieving son, delivering a eulogy that was as polished as it was entirely hollow. He spoke about legacy and stewardship, words that I now understood were just code for the wealth he was in the process of consuming for himself. I watched the people in the pews, our old neighbors and friends, looking at Julian with a mixture of admiration and pity for the burden he was carrying for me. I felt like a spectator at my own funeral, a man whose life had been taken over by a more successful and more ruthless version of himself. Julian was the master of ceremonies, and I was just a prop in the elaborate play he was staging for the benefit of the community and the law. I was a fraud investigator who was watching the perfect crime unfold in front of 1,000 witnesses who didn't see a thing. After the guests had all left and the house was quiet again, Julian sat in my study and told me that he had already made arrangements for me to downsize. He spoke about a luxury senior living community where I would be safe and surrounded by people who could handle my growing needs better than he could. I looked at the man who had been my son, and I saw nothing but a calculator in a suit, a machine that was now ready to discard the remains. "It's for the best, Dad. You're not the man you used to be, and I can't be here 24 hours a day to watch you fail." I felt a sudden, sharp spark of the old Arthur Vance flicker in the back of my mind, a distant and muffled alarm bell that was finally starting to ring. I realized that the isolation, the documents, and the Hanem protection were all part of a single, unified strategy to erase my existence while I was still breathing. I was being disposed of like an old piece of furniture that no longer fit the modern aesthetic of Julian's life and his ambitious, hollow future. The act ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, clinical sound of Julian closing his laptop and telling me that the movers would be arriving in exactly 2 weeks. He didn't ask for my opinion or my consent, having already secured everything he needed to make the decision for me through the documents I had signed. I was a man who had been defeated by his own trust, a victim of a crime that was as legal as it was morally and ethically bankrupt. I looked at the empty space on the wall where Martha's favorite painting used to hang, realizing that it had already been sold to cover a trust expense. I was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into a darkness that I had helped create through my own willful blindness and my desperate love. The final phrase of this act was a realization that I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in 31 years, and the monster was in the house. I should have seen it then, but the truth was still hidden behind a small, heavy brass key that was about to arrive. The absolute breaking point arrived when I discovered a "for sale" sign hidden in the trunk of Julian's car, tucked beneath a stack of high-end golf magazines and luxury brochures. Next to it was an appraisal report for our family home that listed my current status as mentally incapacitated to justify a quick, below-market cash sale to one of his shell companies. He was planning to sell the very roof over my head while I was still sleeping under it, treating my life's work like a clearance sale at a bankrupt department store. I stood in the cold garage, the paper trembling in my hand as the reality of his cruelty finally began to puncture the thick fog of my denial. This was the most grave action he had taken, a total erasure of my autonomy, performed with the clinical indifference of a man disposing of a piece of unwanted, broken furniture. He wasn't just stealing my money anymore. He was stealing my identity and my right to exist in the home I had built with Martha. The garage was silent, the air smelling of gasoline and old motor oil, a sharp contrast to the polished world Julian lived in. I looked at the appraisal again, seeing the cold black ink that declared me unfit to manage my own affairs, signed by a doctor I had never even met. This was the peak of moral indignation. A calculated strike against a father who had given him every advantage and every ounce of his trust. My son had transformed from a protector into a predator of the worst kind, one who used the law as a weapon to facilitate a domestic execution. I felt a surge of adrenaline that I hadn't experienced in years, a primal response to a threat that was now undeniable and imminent. The evidence was right here, caught in the flickering light of the overhead fluorescent lamp, a paper trail of a betrayal that went deeper than I ever imagined. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a man fighting for his literal survival against his own flesh and blood. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon, when Elias Thorne arrived at my doorstep, a man I thought had been long retired and living out his final years in Florida. Elias had been our trusted family attorney for decades, a man of unimpeachable integrity who had seen Julian grow from a boy into the man he had become. Seeing him standing there, his face etched with a mixture of pity and a hard professional determination, was like seeing a ghost manifest from a better time. He didn't waste a single moment on pleasantries. He simply gripped my forearm with surprising strength and looked me straight in the eye with a piercing, urgent intensity. Martha came to see me in total secret 4 months before she passed, Arthur, and she was absolutely terrified of what Julian was doing to you, he whispered. He reached into his worn leather maleta and pulled out a heavy brass key, its weight feeling like a physical anchor in my trembling, sweaty palm. She knew you wouldn't believe the truth without a mountain of undeniable proof, so she spent her final painful months building a fortress of evidence for you, Elias said. He explained that Martha had contacted him through a burner phone, terrified that Julian was monitoring her every email and every digital interaction from the hospital bed. This surprise contact was the catalyst for the entire collapse of the lie Julian had so carefully constructed around our daily lives for 5 long years. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the extent of the fear my wife must have lived in while she was already fighting for her life. Elias gave me a sealed envelope and told me that the key belonged to a private coffer that Martha had established without Julian's knowledge or his financial oversight. The form of this information was so physical and so definitive that it bypassed all the psychological barriers I had erected to protect my son's image. As I took the key, the front door swung open and Julian walked in, his eyes immediately locking onto the glint of brass in my hand with a terrifying, predatory focus. His face went bone white in an instant, the color draining from his skin until he looked like a marble statue of a man who had just seen his own death. He didn't ask what the key was or who the man standing in our foyer was. He simply lunged for my hand with a desperate, animalistic grunt of pure panic. "Give me that key right now, Dad. It's nothing but old private medical records that will only cause you unnecessary and cruel pain," he screamed, his voice hitting a frantic note. I stepped back, my old investigator's reflexes kicking in with a speed that surprised both of us, and I saw the predator clearly for the first time. The image of his face, twisted in a mask of desperation and suppressed rage, was the final image that made the betrayal inarguable and total. I managed to lock myself in the study, the heavy oak door vibrating as Julian pounded on it with his fists, howling like a man who was watching his world burn. Inside the room, I opened the mahogany box that the key fit perfectly, my hands finally steady as the investigator in me took full control of the situation. It wasn't medical records, as Julian had claimed with such frantic energy. It was a meticulous, date-stamped log kept by my wife, documenting every single crime he had committed. For 5 years, Julian hadn't just been managing the family money. He had been running a complex Ponzi scheme using our family friends and neighbors as the primary victims. He had used Martha's forged signature to guarantee the investments, effectively turning her into an unwitting accomplice in his own elaborate and cold-blooded financial fraud. But even this layer of deception, as horrific as it was, turned out to be only the surface of the rot that had infected our home. The deepest blow, the one that truly shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces of irreparable glass, was found on a small silver thumb drive buried at the bottom. I plugged it into my laptop and watched as Martha appeared on the screen, her voice a fragile, ghostly rasp that sounded like it was coming from another dimension. She was crying, her eyes filled with a hollow, haunted look that I had mistaken for the simple pain of her advancing cancer treatments at the time. She explained that Julian had discovered her initial suspicions about the missing funds and had threatened to stop all her supplemental chemotherapy payments if she told me. He had been holding his own mother's literal survival as a bargaining chip, using her life as leverage to ensure his crimes remained hidden in the shadows. He had turned her final months into a living nightmare of coercion and silence, all to protect his $3,000 suits and his German cars. The video ended with Martha looking directly into the camera, her face a mask of love and absolute, devastating regret for the secret she had been forced to keep. "Arthur, please forgive me for not being stronger, but I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you alone and bankrupt before I was even gone," she whispered. The sheer scale of the evil I had raised in my own house was now laid bare, a moral vacuum that had consumed the woman I loved. Julian had not only stolen our money and our future, he had stolen Martha's peace and her dignity during the most vulnerable moments of her entire life. I sat in the absolute, crushing silence of the study, feeling the weight of the red file, starting to form in my mind with a cold, surgical precision. The damage was real, documented with values, names, and specific dates that were now permanently etched into the record of our family's total and complete destruction. The financial loss was calculated at over $1.2 million, a sum that represented every hour of overtime I had worked and every sacrifice Martha and I had made for 30 years. But the number seemed insignificant compared to the revelation of Julian's physical and emotional abuse of his dying mother, a crime that no court could ever truly punish. I looked at the bank statements, seeing the transfers he had made from Martha's oncology fund to a private account in the Cayman Islands on the same day she started her third round. It was a level of depravity that even my 34 years in the fraud department hadn't prepared me to encounter, especially not in my own living room. I felt a cold, sharp clarity take hold of me, a detachment that was necessary for what I had to do next, to restore some semblance of justice. Julian was still outside the door, his pleas now turning into threats, but I no longer heard the voice of my son. I spent the next several hours in a state of silent, focused processing, meticulously cross-referencing Martha's log with the digital records I was finally able to access through Elias's help. Each entry was a fresh wound, a specific instance of Julian's greed overriding any lingering trace of human empathy or basic familial loyalty he might have possessed. I saw how he had manipulated the neighbors, using my wife's illness as a cover for his fraudulent investment pitches, stealing from the very people who brought us meals. He had turned our tragedy into his primary marketing tool, a way to build trust with victims who were too polite to ask for a formal prospectus. The layering of the deception was incredible, a masterclass in domestic fraud that would have been impressive if it weren't so profoundly and utterly soul-crushing. I didn't speak, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't act yet. I just absorbed the full, horrific scope of the situation I was in. "Dad, please, just open the door so we can talk about this like rational adults before someone gets hurt," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and entitlement. I looked at the door, then back at the "for sale" sign and the forged medical report sitting on the desk, feeling a strange sense of calm. The person who had lived in this house for 31 years was gone. and the person who had replaced him was a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a lie. I realized that my son had been counting on my love to keep me blind, never suspecting that the investigator in me was more powerful than the father. He had underestimated the very man who had taught him everything he knew about the world, a mistake that was going to cost him everything he valued. I remained in total silence, the only sound in the room being the low hum of the laptop as it finished downloading the last of the evidence. The silence was my weapon now, a void that Julian was desperately trying to fill with his increasingly frantic and nonsensical explanations for the documents he knew I was reading. He started to apologize, then to blame Martha's confusion, then to claim that Elias Thorne was a senile old man who was trying to tear our family apart. Each lie was more pathetic than the last, a desperate attempt to patch a sinking ship with nothing but words and empty promises of future restitution. I didn't believe a single syllable, my mind already moving past the betrayal and into the realm of tactical response and legal consequences for his actions. The point of no return had been crossed long ago, but it was only in this moment that the bridge was finally and completely blown up behind us. There was no going back to the way things were, no possibility of a reconciliation that didn't involve a full and public accounting of his crimes. I thought about the roses in the garden, the ones I had been pruning while Julian was inside holding my wife's life hostage for the sake of his German car payments. The irony was so sharp it was almost physical, a reminder of how easily the surface of a life can be maintained while the core is being systematically destroyed. I had been a family man first, and that was exactly the weakness that Julian had used to facilitate his 5-year campaign of domestic terror and fraud. I felt a surge of genuine self-criticism, recognizing the many moments where I had chosen to ignore the red flags for the sake of a quiet evening. I had been an accomplice in my own isolation, a man who had handed the predator the keys to the fold because the predator had a familiar face. But the investigator was awake now, and the time for quiet evenings was over. The time for a red file and a federal indictment had finally arrived. "I know you're in there, Arthur, and I know you're looking at things you don't understand," Julian screamed, his voice now filled with a cold, desperate malice that stripped away the last of his charm. He began to threaten to call the police on me, claiming that I was having a mental breakdown and was a danger to myself and others in my confused state. I almost laughed at the audacity of it, seeing how he was trying to use the very legal tools he had prepared to silence me before I could speak. It was the peak of his arrogance, the belief that he could still control the narrative even after the box had been opened and the evidence revealed. He had no idea that I was already several steps ahead of him, my mind working with a clinical efficiency that he had never seen before. I was no longer his father. I was his most dangerous adversary, the one man who could navigate the wreckage and find the truth. The final revelation in the box was a series of emails Julian had sent to a real estate developer discussing the disposal of the Vance property and the replacement of his father. He spoke about me as if I were a burden to be minimized, a data point in his path to a more successful and less encumbered life in another city. He had already planned my future in a facility 3 hours away, where he wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of my grief or my questions. The level of premeditation was staggering, a total betrayal of the very concept of family and the duty of a son to his aging parents. I closed the box, the click of the lock sounding like a final, definitive period at the end of a long and tragic chapter of my life. I was ready to move from the processing phase into the execution phase of the plan I was already building in my mind. The investigation was over. The prosecution was about to begin in earnest. I looked at the photograph of Martha on my desk, her eyes bright and filled with the light that Julian had so cruelly extinguished before her time was even up. I felt a sense of duty to her that transcended the pain of the betrayal, a need to restore her honor and the legacy he had so casually defiled. Julian's pounding on the door finally stopped, replaced by the sound of his heavy, retreating footsteps and the slamming of the front door as he left the house. He was likely going to consult with his own lawyers or try to move the remaining funds before I could react, unaware that Elias was already blocking his access. I stayed in the study, the darkness of the room matching the cold. Sharp clarity of my intent, a man with a mission and a mountain of proof. The silence that followed was the most peaceful moment I had experienced in 5 years, the quiet before the final, decisive confrontation that would end his reign. The final phrase of this act was a silent commitment to the truth, a promise to the woman I had loved that her suffering would not be in vain and her son would face the law. I stood up, my joints creaking but my spirit feeling stronger than it had since before the first round of chemotherapy had begun in that oncology ward. I was Arthur Vance, lead insurance fraud investigator, and I had just uncovered the biggest case of my life, one that I was going to win with total and absolute certainty. The evidence was in my hand, the plan was in my head, and the justice was coming for the man who had forgotten who his father really was. The point of no return was behind me, and the path forward was lit by the cold, uncompromising light of the truth contained within that mahogany box. I was ready to finish this, once and for all, and ensure that the consequences were as poetically just as the crimes were cruel. I sat in the heavy silence of that room for 10 minutes, watching the dust motes dance in the dying light, until the grief was replaced by something cold and familiar. The fog of the grieving widower evaporated instantly, leaving behind the calculating mind of the lead fraud investigator who had seen every trick in the book before. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a hunter who had finally found the scent. And the man outside that door was no longer my son, but my next primary target. "You made a fatal mistake, Julian," I whispered to the empty, shadowed room, feeling a predatory calm settle over my bones for the first time in 5 long years. "You tried to run a low-level shell game on a man who spent 3 decades dismantling billion-dollar cartels, and now I'm going to show you exactly what an expert looks like." The transition was absolute. The emotional ties were severed with a surgeon's scalpel, leaving only the mission to restore justice. I didn't call the local police or make a scene. Instead, I reached for the phone and dialed the private number of Sarah Jenkins, a forensic accountant I had worked with for 20 years. "Sarah, it's Arthur Vance. I need a deep tissue audit on a domestic trust and 3 shadow shell companies, and I need the preliminary data by dawn," I said, using the shorthand of our profession. I knew that Julian's wealth management firm was likely a house of cards, and Sarah was the only person with the clearance and the speed to help me tear it down. She didn't ask questions about the late hour or the personal nature of the request. She simply opened her terminal and began the digital necropsy of the Vance family estate. My experience told me that people like Julian always leave a trail of layering and integration that looks complex to the amateur eye but is transparent to a seasoned pro. We were beginning a high-stakes forensic investigation into the man who thought I was too old to count my own change. Using my investigator credentials and the specific access codes Martha had hidden in her log, I bypassed Julian's encrypted firewalls with a systematic professional ease that he never anticipated. I spent the next 48 hours compiling a red file, the exact same 40-page dossier format I had used to send Fortune 500 CEOs to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. I documented every single forged signature, every unauthorized wire transfer to his offshore account in the Caymans, and the specific mental incapacity fraud he was attempting to leverage. Sarah found the smoking gun in a series of commingled accounts where Julian had used my pension funds to pay off the angry investors from his previous failed ventures. He had no idea that the man he thought was slipping into dementia was actually building a digital gallows, one line of incriminating code at a time, within the safety of his own study. The wealth manager was about to learn the true meaning of a comprehensive audit from a man who wrote the manual. The plan was a masterpiece of controlled escalation, designed to lure Julian into a final, irreversible act of greed that would trigger federal oversight without him ever suspecting my hand. I intentionally didn't freeze the accounts or change the passwords. I wanted him to feel the thrill of a successful getaway as he prepared his final exit strategy from my life. I leaked a fake confirmation through a mutual contact that I was ready to sign the sale papers for the house, knowing it would prompt him to make one last massive transfer. As predicted, he attempted to move a final $200,000 withdrawal from the trust, a move I knew would trigger a mandatory suspicious activity report with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I worked with Elias Thorne to ensure the paper trail was airtight, creating a loop where Julian's own greed became the very mechanism of his legal and professional destruction. The trap was set with the same technical precision I had used in 1,000 other cases. By the second night of the operation, the pieces were all in place, and the red file was sitting on my desk, a physical manifestation of my son's total moral bankruptcy. I felt several steps ahead of him at every turn, anticipating his maneuvers like a grandmaster playing a novice who had just learned the basic rules of the game. I watched him through the house monitors, seeing him pace the living room with a celebratory bottle of champagne, completely unaware that his freedom was now measured in hours. The aliasing of accounts and the layering of transactions that he thought were so clever were actually elementary mistakes when viewed through the lens of a 30-year veteran. I felt a grim, silent satisfaction as I realized that the wealth manager was about to face a level of scrutiny that his polished, expensive suits could never deflect. Every click of my keyboard was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance, and I knew the confrontation was now inevitable. Julian's strategy had relied entirely on the assumption that I would remain a passive, emotional participant in my own tragedy, a mistake that many young fraudsters make when targeting the elderly. He didn't account for the professional muscle memory that kicks in when a veteran investigator sees a pattern of systemic abuse and financial irregularity. I was using a triangulation method to map his offshore movements, a technique I had perfected while hunting insurance rings in the late 90s before he was even in high school. Sarah Jenkins confirmed that Julian had been using a classic churning technique on our secondary accounts to generate fake fees for his struggling firm, leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs. I compiled these findings into a secondary report, a technical addendum that would make it impossible for any defense attorney to claim a simple misunderstanding of the family trust. The level of detail was surgical, covering every minute detail of the 5-year betrayal with a cold, uncompromising accuracy that left no room for escape. To ensure the plan's success, I had to play the part of the confused father for one last day, a performance that required every ounce of my self-control and my remaining patience. I let Julian explain the new documents to me, nodding vacantly while I secretly recorded our conversation on a high-fidelity device hidden within the mahogany box itself. He spoke with such a chilling lack of empathy, describing the benefits of the assisted living facility, while he was actually signing the orders for the final asset liquidation. Every word he spoke was a further admission of guilt, a verbal confirmation of the premeditated nature of the elder abuse and the financial fraud he was committing. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were watching a recorded deposition of a stranger rather than having a conversation with my only living child. He was so confident in his deception that he didn't even notice the small, red recording light reflecting in my glasses as I agreed to his terms. The element of surprise was my most powerful weapon, and I guarded it with a ferocity that matched the depth of the betrayal I had suffered at his hands. I had Elias Thorne prepare a cease and desist order that would be served simultaneously with the red file during our final dinner, ensuring he couldn't move any more funds. Sarah Jenkins was on standby to lock the vaults the moment I gave the signal, a coordinated strike that would freeze Julian's firm's assets in 3 different jurisdictions. We were using a mirror image protocol to ensure that every move he made was instantly documented and countered by our legal team before he could even react. The level of coordination was something he had never faced in his career of dealing with high-net-worth individuals who were too polite to question his methods. He was about to be hit with the full force of a professional investigative strike, delivered by the man who had provided the very capital he was currently trying to steal. "Tomorrow is going to be a big day for both of us, Julian," I said as we parted ways for the night, my voice steady and devoid of any lingering traces of anger. He smiled, a flash of white teeth in the hallway, believing that tomorrow he would finally be free of the burden of his father and the ghost of his mother. "It's for the best. Dad, you'll see that I've taken care of everything just the way you would have wanted me to," he replied with a wink. I watched him walk away, his confidence radiating from him like a physical heat, and I felt a brief, passing moment of pity for the absolute ruin awaiting him. He had no idea that the everything he had taken care of was actually the evidence that would lead to a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal prison. I returned to the study and checked the red file one last time, ensuring that the poetic justice of the situation was as airtight as the financial forensics. The plan was now consolidating, with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit already monitoring the suspicious activity reports Sarah and I had triggered through our strategic, intentional account leaks. Every step was calculated to minimize the damage to the remaining Vance estate, while maximizing the legal exposure of Julian and his co-conspirators in the shadow shell companies. I felt several steps ahead of him, anticipating his final desperate moves like a seasoned hunter waiting for the prey to step into the clearing at the edge of the woods. The wealth manager was operating on a set of rules that I had helped write decades ago, and his lack of original thinking was his final, most critical failure. I sat in Martha's chair, the scent of jasmine still lingering in the air, and I promised her that the truth would be out before the sun set the next day. The confrontation was coming, and for the first time in 5 years, the balance of power in the Vance house was exactly where it belonged. I spent the final hours before the confrontation reviewing the asset recovery section of my plan, ensuring that the neighbors Julian had defrauded would be the first to be made whole. I had documented their losses with the same precision as my own, creating a victim impact folder that would be a cornerstone of the prosecution's case against his firm. I wanted Julian to understand that his crimes had a human cost, a reality he had spent years ignoring in favor of his spreadsheets and his German car payments. The poetic justice of the situation was that his own firm's compliance documents would be the very evidence used to prove his willful intent to defraud the elderly. He had provided us with the rope, the stool, and the instructions, and now all I had to do was step back and let the law take its course. I felt a strange sense of peace, a clarity that comes only when the mission is clear and the outcome is certain. The ally I had in Sarah Jenkins was indispensable, her technical expertise providing the hard data that turned my investigative theories into undeniable, court-admissible evidence of criminal activity. She worked through the night, her messages appearing on my screen like a countdown to Julian's ultimate professional and social destruction in the city of Columbus. "We have the wire logs, Arthur. He's finished," she sent at 4:15 a.m., accompanied by a final, comprehensive spreadsheet of the 5-year embezzlement scheme. I felt a surge of professional respect for her, a reminder of the many cases we had closed together back when I was the one leading the charge in the department. This case, however, was personal, and the satisfaction of finding the final smoking gun was tempered by the knowledge that the perpetrator was my own son. But the investigator in me pushed that thought aside, focusing entirely on the technical perfection of the red file and the coming scene of confrontation. I checked the house monitors one last time, seeing Julian sleeping the peaceful sleep of a man who believes he has committed the perfect crime against his own grieving father. I wondered what he would look like when the mask finally slipped and he realized that the confused old man was actually his most formidable and dangerous opponent. The contrast between his current arrogance and his coming collapse was going to be the most satisfying part of the entire process for me as an investigator. I had seen this moment 100 times before in the interrogation room. The exact second when a fraudster realizes that the evidence is insurmountable and their world is over. I was going to deliver that moment to my own son, not out of cruelty, but out of a deep and abiding need to restore the truth Martha died protecting. The countdown had reached the final hour, and the atmosphere in the house was charged with the electricity of an impending and violent storm of justice. "Dad, are you ready for our final meeting?" Julian asked through the door the next morning, his voice filled with a fake, practiced cheerfulness that made my skin crawl with visceral disgust. I took a deep breath, adjusted my glasses, and looked at the red file, sitting on the mahogany desk, like a loaded weapon ready to be discharged. "I'm ready, Julian. Let's finish this once and for all," I replied, my voice calm and steady, betraying nothing of the strategic fire burning in my mind. I heard his retreating footsteps, his walk sounding more like a victory lap than a trip to a dining room, and I followed him with a slow, deliberate pace. The stage was set, the evidence was gathered, and the justice was waiting to be served on a silver platter of cold, forensic facts and undeniable truth. I was no longer a victim. I was the lead investigator, and the final act of the investigation was about to begin in earnest. The dining room was exactly as it had been for 30 years, but the air felt different, as if the walls themselves were anticipating the coming collapse of the lies they had sheltered. I sat at the head of the table, the position of authority that Julian had tried so hard to usurp through his 5-year campaign of domestic terror. He sat opposite me, his tablet open and his pen ready, looking like a man who was about to close the biggest deal of his successful and hollow career. I reached into my folder and pulled out the first page of the red file, placing it face down on the polished mahogany between us like a challenge. He didn't even look at it at first, continuing his speech about the next chapter and the benefits of professional care for a man in my delicate and confused state. I waited for him to finish, for the last of his lies to be spoken into the quiet room, before I finally spoke the first words of the confrontation. I invited Julian over for dinner on a Tuesday evening, choosing the formal dining room where the mahogany table acted as a physical barrier between my world and his. The room was dimly lit, the shadows stretching across the walls, creating an atmosphere of a deposition rather than a family gathering. Julian arrived looking smug and radiating a false sense of victory, likely believing that tonight was the night I would finally succumb and sign the papers for the assisted living home. "I'm so glad you're finally seeing sense, Dad," he said with a condescending smile as he reached for his glass of expensive red wine, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who thought he had already won the war. He spoke about new beginnings and peace of mind, his voice smooth and untroubled, completely unaware that the air in the room was thick with the scent of his own impending professional and social demise. I sat there in total silence, watching him play the part of the devoted son for one last, pathetic time before I dismantled his entire existence with the truth. I did not reach for a pen, nor did I acknowledge his rehearsed speech about my supposed mental decline. Instead, I slowly pushed a thick, 40-page insurance fraud dossier across the polished wood. The smirk on his face died instantly, replaced by a look of confusion that rapidly curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as he read the first 5 pages. "What exactly is this, Arthur?" he asked, his voice trembling and dropping the dad persona as he realized the technical depth of the information laid out before his eyes. "It is your entire career, your freedom, and your stolen inheritance," I replied, in a voice that was dry, calm, and entirely devoid of the paternal warmth he had spent years exploiting. I informed him that a digital copy had already been transmitted to the district attorney's office and to his 3 largest clients who were currently being defrauded by his schemes. The investigator in me felt no pity, only the cold satisfaction of a case finally closed with undeniable and absolute evidence of criminal intent. He turned a sickly, translucent shade of grey, his hand shaking so violently that the red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, looking like a fresh blood stain between us. You can't do this to me. I am your only son, your own flesh and blood," he stammered, his arrogance collapsing into a pathetic, whimpering plea for a mercy he had never shown Martha. I watched him fall apart in real time, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for the hollow, desperate man sitting across from me in the dim light. The collapse was total and proportional to the immense scale of the betrayal he had orchestrated against the very people who had given him everything. "No, Julian," I replied, standing up with a heavy finality that echoed through the silent house. "You aren't my son anymore. You are just another fraudulent claim I have investigated, processed, and officially denied with the full weight of the law behind me." I watched his posture slump as the reality of his situation finally settled into his bones, the predator becoming the prey. The consequences were swift, clinical, and devastatingly precise, exactly as I had planned when I first opened that hidden box and felt the cold steel of justice return to my heart. Julian was arrested exactly 48 hours later by federal agents, charged with grand theft, multiple counts of wire fraud, and egregious elder abuse under the state's harshest statutes. The financial hit to my own life was brutal. I lost approximately 40% of my total life savings to his high-risk gambles, but the red file allowed for a legal clawback of our home. Socially, he became a total pariah in Columbus, his name scrubbed from every club and board he had once spent so much of our money to join and influence. The poetic justice was undeniable and named explicitly in the court records. The man who tried to lock his father in a tiny, controlled room for profit was now the one destined for a federal cell. He lost his reputation, his liberty, and the very wealth he had tried to steal, proving that even the most polished lie eventually shatters. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence, a moment of public accounting that Julian never believed would come to pass in his world of luxury and lies. I sat in the front row, wearing the same suit I wore to Martha's funeral, a silent witness to the final destruction of the Vance family name as we knew it. Julian wouldn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the floor as the shackles were placed around his wrists, the sound of the metal clicking echoing like a final period. The prosecutor used my red file as the primary blueprint for the government's case, citing the meticulous and professional nature of the investigation as the reason for the swift conviction. Every forged signature and every stolen dollar was accounted for, leaving no room for the expensive defense team to manufacture a reasonable doubt for the jury. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with the same clinical, a cold-blooded efficiency that Julian had used to rob his own mother of her final, peaceful months of life. The news of the arrest hit the local papers the following morning. The headline, "Prominent Wealth Manager Indicted in Multi-million-dollar Family Fraud," serving as the final nail in the coffin of his social standing. The neighbors he had defrauded were the first to call, their voices a mixture of shock and profound gratitude that I had found the evidence they couldn't see. I shared the asset recovery documents with their lawyers, ensuring that the poetic justice extended to every single victim of Julian's predatory ambition and his hollow investment schemes. His firm was liquidated within a month. The expensive furniture and the German cars sold at auction to repay the mounting debts and the legal restitution ordered by the court. The man who lived for the surface of things was now completely exposed. His life a cautionary tale of greed and the inevitable collapse of a domestic house of cards. He was no longer a player in the world of high finance. He was a number in the federal prison system, stripped of everything. One of the most satisfying moments of the aftermath was seeing the "for sale" sign removed from my front lawn and replaced by the vibrant, healthy roses of my garden. The legal battle to reclaim the title of the house was long and complex. But with Elias Thorne's expertise, the mental incapacity fraud Julian had staged was completely overturned. I stood on my porch, breathing in the fresh air of a house that finally belonged to me again, free from the shadow of my son's controlling and malevolent presence. The financial loss of nearly $500,000 was a high price to pay, but the return of my autonomy and my name was worth every single penny of the recovered funds. I was a man of 68 who had been given a second chance at a quiet life, a gift that Martha had secured for me from her hospital bed. The poetic justice was that Julian's attempt to erase me had actually resulted in the total and permanent erasure of his own future and his legacy. The final report from the FBI detailed the shadow accounts Julian had used to facilitate the chemotherapy threats against Martha, a detail that turned the public opinion entirely against him. Even his most loyal associates at the golf club turned their backs, disgusted by the revelation of his cruelty toward a dying woman who had only ever loved him. The poetic justice reached its peak when the judge ordered that Julian's remaining personal assets, including his vintage watch collection, be auctioned to fund a local hospice center in Martha's name. Everything he had valued, everything he had defined himself by, was now being used to honor the woman he had tried to silence and exploit for his own gain. He was left with nothing but the gray walls of his cell and the memory of the father he had vastly underestimated in his arrogance. The investigation was officially closed, the evidence was filed away, and the justice of the Vance family was finally and irrevocably restored to the record. I remember the look on the federal agent's face when I handed over the final silver thumb drive, the one containing Martha's ghostly, heartbreaking testimony against our own child. "This is the most thorough domestic case I've ever seen, Mr. Vance," he said, shaking my hand with a look of genuine, professional respect that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had finally done his job, even if the perpetrator was the one person I was supposed to protect. The consequences were not just legal, they were spiritual. A cleansing of the house that had been infected by 5 years of systematic and cold-blooded domestic betrayal. Julian's firm's name was removed from the glass doors of his downtown office, replaced by a "for lease" sign that mirrored the one he had tried to put on my own life. The man of status was gone, replaced by the reality of a common criminal whose only legacy was the pain he had caused to those who trusted him most. In the final accounting, the loss was measured not in dollars, but in the 31 years of memories that had been tainted by the discovery of Julian's long-term and calculated deception. I had to go through every photo and every letter, wondering which moments were real and which were part of the elaborate performance he had been giving us. The consequence for Julian was a mandatory 10-year sentence. But the consequence for me was a lifetime of questioning the foundation of my own family and my own instincts. Yet, as the investigator, I knew that the truth, no matter how painful, was always preferable to the comfortable lie that was slowly killing my wife and my soul. The poetic justice of him losing his freedom while I regained mine was a symmetry that even the most cynical fraud investigator could appreciate in the quiet of the night. The story was moving into its final chapter, where the silence of the house would finally be filled with the peace of a life lived in the light. Julian's collapse was not just financial, It was a total psychological disintegration that occurred the moment he realized I was several steps ahead of him throughout the entire forensic process. He spent his final days of freedom trying to hide the remaining funds, unaware that Sarah Jenkins had already mapped every single movement to the penny for the federal authorities. The poetic justice of his own technical expertise being used to track and trap him was a detail that the prosecution highlighted during the final sentencing hearing in the Columbus courthouse. He was a man who believed he was smarter than the system, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had taught him how the system actually worked. He was undone by his own vanity, a classic flaw of the high-level fraudster that I had documented in hundreds of cases during my 34 years in the department. The consequences were a mirror image of his crimes, a perfect reflection of the greed and the cruelty he had brought into our home. The final meeting with the district attorney was a short, professional affair that finalized the restitution plan for the neighbors and the restoration of my primary pension funds through the insurance clawbacks. I walked out of the government building into the bright afternoon sun, feeling a sense of weightlessness that I hadn't experienced since before Martha's first diagnosis. The case was over. The red file was a matter of public record, and the man who had tried to steal my life was safely behind bars for the next decade. I had achieved the justice I sought, but the victory was a quiet one, a somber acknowledgement of the high cost of the truth in a world of lies. I drove home to the house on the corner, the one Julian had tried to sell, and I realized that for the first time in 5 years, I was the only one who held the keys to my own future. The confrontation was a memory, the consequences were a reality, and the Vance family was finally and truly at peace with the evidence. The courtroom victory felt hollow as I walked back into the empty house, the heavy silence of the hallways reminding me that I had won a war but lost my entire world. Every time I pass by Julian's old childhood bedroom, I don't see the face of the federal inmate. I see the small, 5-year-old boy who used to be afraid of the dark and ran to my bed for safety. I find myself wondering exactly where the path diverged, or if Martha and I loved him with such a blinding intensity that we inadvertently smothered his burgeoning conscience and sense of duty. This house is far too quiet now, and the taste of the legal victory is like ash in my mouth because the one person I desperately want to share the truth with is the one whose memory was used as a weapon against me. I realized then that a successful investigation can identify the guilty and recover the assets, but it can never truly repair the shattered soul of a family built on a foundation of sophisticated lies. I spent several days going through Martha's old belongings, trying to reconcile the woman in my memories with the terrified victim portrayed in the forensic files. The legal battle had restored my bank account, but it couldn't bring back the 31 years of innocence I thought we shared as a perfect unit. I sat in her favorite armchair, clutching a worn sweater that still held a faint trace of her jasmine perfume, and felt the crushing weight of a grief that was no longer simple or clean. My victory in the red file was a professional triumph, but a personal tragedy that left me standing alone in a house filled with ghosts of a life that never truly existed the way I imagined it. I have the house, I have the title, and I have my name. But the cost of this clarity was the total destruction of the only legacy I ever really cared about. It is a lonely thing to be the only one left who knows the full, unvarnished truth about the Vance family and its ultimate, violent collapse. The ambiguity of my emotions is a constant companion now, a grey mist that settles over even the most productive and peaceful of my retirement days in Columbus. I am grateful for the justice that was served, yet I am haunted by the image of Julian in his orange jumpsuit, stripped of the arrogance that was his only armor. There is no easy resolution to the conflict of a father who has prosecuted his own son, No simple way to categorize the mixture of relief and profound regret that I feel every single morning. I have realized that the truth doesn't always set you free in the way the stories promise. Sometimes it just leaves you standing in the ruins of your own life with a clearer view of the wreckage. I carry the memory of Martha's ghostly video testimony like a lead weight, a reminder that my professional instincts were the only thing that could save me, even as they destroyed the very thing I loved most. This is not a story of triumph, but a story of survival in the aftermath of an intimate and devastating domestic betrayal. Julian sent me a handwritten letter from the minimum security facility in Kentucky last month, the paper smelling faintly of industrial detergent and old, recycled air. He didn't offer a genuine apology for the millions he stole or the lives he ruined. Instead, he apologized specifically for the threat he made regarding Martha's life-saving chemotherapy treatments. He asked if I could find it in my heart to send him the framed photograph of the three of us at the lake back in the summer of 1998, when life was still simple. It was a pathetic, small attempt at connection, a reach for a past that he had systematically set on fire for the sake of his own selfish and hollow ambition. I read the letter 3 times, looking for a sign of real change. But I only found the same calculated tone he had used to manage me for 5 long and painful years. He is a man looking for a reprieve, not a man looking for a genuine and deep-seated internal redemption for his crimes. I sent the photograph the next morning without a note, but I have not yet found the strength or the desire to visit him behind the reinforced glass of the visitation room. I am not quite ready to offer him the forgiveness he craves, but I am also far too tired to carry the burning weight of hatred in my chest every single day. The door to our relationship isn't locked from the outside, but it is certainly not standing open for a warm and easy welcome either. I told him in a brief reply that the photo was the last thing I would send, a final piece of a world that no longer exists for either of us. He must live with the consequences of his choices, just as I must live with the consequences of my own willful blindness and my desperate need to believe a lie. Our connection is now a matter of legal records and occasional correspondence, a shadow of the bond that I once thought was the strongest thing in my entire life. I spend the majority of my quiet mornings in the garden now, where the rhythm of the seasons offers a predictable and honest comfort that people often fail to provide. The roses are healthy and vibrant again, their deep red petals a stark contrast to the grey memories that used to haunt these flower beds during the long years of Julian's control. I keep the mahogany box on my desk in the study, but it has been completely emptied of its dark secrets and the evidence of my son's profound moral failures. It holds my collection of stamps and my sharp gardening shears now, serving as a functional tool for my new life rather than a tomb for my wife's hidden fears. The object has been reclaimed, much like my own life, and it no longer carries the power to make my hands shake when I touch the polished, dark wood of its lid. It is just a box again, a simple container for the present moment, no longer burdened by the heavy, suffocating weight of 3 decades of domestic deception. The afternoon sun hits the porch at the same angle it did 30 years ago, but the person sitting there is a man who has finally learned to see the world as it truly is. I watch the neighbors walk by, and I feel a sense of belonging that is no longer filtered through Julian's lies or his manufactured social isolation of my life. I am taking small, concrete steps to rebuild my world, attending the neighborhood poker games again, and inviting my brother David over for long overdue fishing trips at the local reservoir. I am reclaiming the fragments of my identity that were nearly erased by my son's greed, finding a quiet strength in the simple acts of a normal, unmanaged daily existence. The house no longer feels like a prison or a crime scene. It feels like a home again, albeit a quieter one than I had ever planned for my final years. I am learning to live with the silence, finding that it is not a void, but a space where the truth can finally breathe without fear of being silenced. I still wake up at 6 a.m. every single day for my first cup of coffee, but I no longer look at the empty chair across the table with a sense of absolute despair. I look at it with the hard-won peace of a man who finally knows the absolute truth about his past and is no longer afraid of what the next mail delivery might bring. The evidence of my life is finally clear. Existence continues its steady march forward, even when the people you love the most turn out to be the ones who were working the hardest to destroy you. I am Arthur Vance, and for the first time in 31 long and complicated years, I am not investigating a crime, a lie, or a hidden motive in the shadows. I'm simply living my life on my own terms, finally free from the burden of the family man image I spent so much of my soul trying to protect at all costs. I have the truth, I have my dignity, and I have a garden that is finally starting to bloom again under my own steady and honest hand. Life is a series of investigations, but the most important one is the truth you tell yourself when you are finally alone in the dark after the storm has passed. If this story reminded you to check the contents of your own boxes before it's too late, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice and family. Watch the next video appearing on your screen right now, because you won't believe the level of deception that was uncovered in that case either. And I want you to stay informed. Comment below with your own thoughts on family trust, and tell me if you think I made the right choice by putting my son behind bars for the truth. Your support helps me keep telling these difficult stories, ensuring that the evidence is always presented and the justice is always served for those who can no longer speak. I'm Arthur Vance, and I'll see you in the next investigation, where we will peel back another layer of the human heart together in the light.